Christians have been debating for centuries whether Jesus actually had brothers. You probably have an opinion about it yourself. After all, there are passages in the Bible that at first glance sound like they're saying exactly that. But there's another view, one that I came across recently, and it's been sticking with me ever since. According to this view, Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, wasn't a young man when he married Mary. He was actually older. And before meeting her, he had children with another woman. These children would later become known as Jesus' brothers. Now, if that idea sounds like a bit of a stretch, hang on. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through several reasons, biblical, historical, and just plain logical, that have really made me take this view seriously. And I think by the end, you might start seeing it differently too. If we haven't met yet, my name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I run Capturing Christianity, where we explore the big questions about God, Jesus, and the truth of the Christian faith. We dig into history, philosophy, theology, all the light and fluffy stuff. With that introduction out of the way, let's start at the very beginning. What did the earliest Christians actually believe about the so-called brothers of Jesus? Reason 1. What did the earliest Christians believe? When we talk about the earliest Christians, I don't just mean people who lived a couple centuries later. I mean those closest to the time of the apostles, whose understanding of Jesus' family would have been shaped by stories passed down from the first generation. One of the earliest writings we have that touches on this is the Proto-Evangelium of James, dated to the 2nd century. It's not part of the Bible, but it does give us a fascinating window into what early Christians actually thought. In it, Joseph is described as an elderly widower with children from a previous marriage, chosen to be the guardian of Mary, who had taken a vow of virginity. The text paints him not as a newlywed, but as someone already established in life, now stepping into a sort of protective role. This, of course, doesn't prove that this view is correct or anything, but it does tell us that from very early on, Christians saw no problem reconciling the gospel accounts with the idea that Joseph had kids before marrying Mary. Reason 2. Joseph falls out of the story early. If you read through the Gospels, you'll notice something kind of curious. Joseph is there when Jesus is a baby. He's there when Jesus is a boy. And then he's just sort of gone, like completely gone. We never hear about him again. By the time of the crucifixion, Joseph is conspicuously absent. Luke 2 even gives us an early hint that this would happen. When Joseph and Mary bring the infant Jesus to the temple, Simeon blesses both of them, but then turns specifically to Mary and says, "A sword will pierce your own soul also." It's actually a striking detail. Why speak only to Mary about the deep grief that was to come? The simplest explanation is that Joseph wouldn't be there when it happened. That absence alone might not prove anything, but it's worth asking. If Joseph were alive when Jesus was crucified, wouldn't he actually be there? Not only for his son, but also for Mary, who at that moment was facing unthinkable grief. His disappearance from the narrative strongly suggests he had died years earlier. And if Joseph was already older when he married Mary, this would make perfect sense. In that time and culture, people didn't wait until their late years to marry for the first time. If he was older, it's reasonable to think he may have been married before and perhaps even had children from that marriage, children who would later be called Jesus' brothers. When you see the story through that lens, Joseph's quiet exit from the Gospels isn't just a strange narrative gap. It actually fits neatly into this whole picture. Reason 3, the Passover at age 12. There's another moment in Luke 2 that stands out once you start looking really closely at it. In this chapter, we get the only snapshot of Jesus' life between infancy and adulthood, the trip to Jerusalem for Passover when he was 12 years old. Luke tells us that his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. After the festival, Joseph and Mary began the journey back home without realizing Jesus wasn't with them. They eventually found him back in the temple talking with the teachers. If you're a Christian, you probably heard this story 1,000 times, but here's the interesting part. Okay, the text explicitly mentions only Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. No brothers, no sisters, no hint of a bigger family traveling together. And given how detailed Luke tends to be, the absence here is actually pretty striking. If younger siblings existed at this point, we'd expect them to be included in this account, or at least alluded to. But if Joseph's other children were from a previous marriage and already older, they wouldn't have been part of this family trip at all, right? Once again, the silence of this text fits the older widower theory far more naturally than the idea of a bustling household of young siblings growing up alongside Jesus. Reason 4, Jesus' brothers doubted him. One of the more curious details in the Gospels is that Jesus' own brothers didn't believe in him, at least Not at first, right? John 7:5 says it plainly, for even his brothers did not believe in him. Now think about how odd that is if these were younger brothers who grew up in the same household. If Mary was their mother, they would have been raised on the stories of Jesus' miraculous birth. They would have seen his character up close every single day, maybe even witnessed some of his early signs. You'd expect at least a cautious openness, if not outright belief. But on the other hand, if these brothers were older half-siblings from Joseph's previous marriage, it's much easier to understand. They wouldn't have had the same upbringing as Jesus. They wouldn't have been raised under the direct influence of Mary's unique perspective. Instead, they might have seen Jesus as their much younger stepbrother, or perhaps even viewed his sudden ministry with skepticism. So what at first looks like a theological problem actually makes a lot of human sense if you see the family dynamics through this older widower lens. Reason 5, Jude, the brother of James. Next, let's look at something from one of the smallest books in the New Testament, the letter of Jude. In the very first verse, Jude introduces himself this way. He says, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. It's a really curious way to put it. If you were the blood brother of Jesus, wouldn't you think about mentioning that? It's certainly a stronger credential than being the brother of James, but Jude doesn't go there. He identifies himself in relation to James instead. This makes more sense if James was the eldest son from Joseph's earlier marriage. In that case, James would have been the family figurehead, someone Jude's audience would immediately recognize. And it fits neatly with the idea that Jude and James were Jesus' stepbrothers, not younger siblings who grew up in the same household with him. When you see it this way, Jude's introduction isn't just like a random choice. It's another little clue that the family relationships behind the term brothers were more complex than we might assume at first glance. Reason 6, and this one is really important. Jesus gives Mary to John at the crucifixion. Finally, let's fast forward to the crucifixion scene. In John 19, we see one of the most moving moments in the entire gospel. Jesus, hanging on the cross, entrusts the care of his mother to the beloved disciple, John. Woman, behold your son, behold your mother. And from that moment, John took Mary into his home, and the Bible notes that she was with him for the rest of her earthly life. Now, in Jewish culture, if a woman's husband died, the responsibility to care for her would naturally fall to her children, especially her sons. If Jesus had full biological brothers, this sort of arrangement with John would have been unnecessary, even inappropriate. Her other children would have been the ones expected to step in. But if Jesus was Mary's only child, this actually makes perfect sense. And if the men referred to as his brothers were actually older half-brothers from Joseph's earlier marriage, their obligation to Mary would not have been the same as that of a biological son. Jesus, knowing this, entrusted her to someone that he could rely on completely. It's a really small detail in the text, but it speaks volumes about what Jesus' family structure may have actually looked like. So when you put these different pieces together, the earliest Christian traditions, Joseph's quiet disappearance from the story, the absence of siblings in Jesus' youth, the initial doubt of his brothers, his decision to entrust Mary to John, and even the way Jude identifies himself, a coherent picture starts to emerge. It's the picture of an older Joseph, a widower, who had children from a previous marriage before marrying Mary. And while we can't prove this view beyond all doubt, I think there are strong reasons to take it seriously. It's a view that not only makes sense of the biblical data, but it also aligns with the way that many early Christians understood the story. Of course, other explanations exist, and I'm not here to shut down the conversation. My hope is that this gives you something to think about, okay? Maybe even to go back and revisit some of those familiar passages with fresh eyes. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And by the way, Christianity is true.